The morning of February 25th, 1945, began with frost coating the runway at Rheine-Hopsten Airfield in northwestern Germany. Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann sat in the cramped cockpit of his Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, and felt the familiar vibration of the twin Junkers Jumo 004 engines spooling up behind him. At 540 miles per hour, no Allied piston-engine fighter could touch him. Once airborne, the swept-wing aircraft beneath him represented Germany's technological triumph, a machine so advanced that it belonged to a different century. Yet, on this frozen morning, technological superiority would mean absolutely nothing. Within minutes, Hoffmann and 5 of his squadron mates would be dead, destroyed not by superior enemy aircraft, but by a simple tactical reality they never overcame. The Messerschmitt 262 was genuinely revolutionary. When it entered operational service with Kommando Nowotny in September 1944, Allied bomber crews called it the blow that could not be parried. Its 430mm Mk-108 cannons could shred a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress with a single burst. Test pilot Captain Erich Braun, who flew captured German jets after the war, called it the most formidable aircraft of World War II. The aircraft could reach speeds approaching 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour, faster than the North American P-51 Mustang, making it theoretically invincible in aerial combat. German engineers had achieved something remarkable, creating an aircraft that pointed toward aviation's future, while the rest of the world still flew machines designed in the 1930s. But revolutionary technology requires revolutionary infrastructure to sustain it. The 262's Junkers engines consumed fuel at 3 times the rate of conventional fighters. Their turbine blades, which should have been manufactured from heat-resistant chromium-nickel alloys, were instead crafted from mild steel because Germany's supply chains had collapsed. Those blades required replacement after just 10 to 25 hours of operation. The engines themselves demanded careful throttle management. Aggressive inputs could cause compressor stalls, flameouts, or catastrophic failures that would leave a pilot helpless. Most critically, the jet engines needed time to build thrust. During takeoff and landing, the 262 moved in predictable straight lines while its engines slowly spooled up to operational power. For those vulnerable minutes, the world's fastest fighter became defenseless. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. American fighter pilots recognized this weakness immediately. By early 1945, Allied intelligence had identified approximately 30 airfields capable of supporting 262 operations. Each became a priority target, not for bombing alone, but for systematic fighter patrols designed to catch the jets at their most vulnerable moments. Colonel John Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group had pioneered these tactics in January 1945 during sweeps over Germany. His tactical insight transformed the air war. If American fighters couldn't catch the 262 in flight, they would simply destroy them on the ground or ambush them during the critical seconds of takeoff and landing. The tactic proved devastatingly effective because it exploited fundamental physics the Germans couldn't overcome. Jet engines generate thrust by compressing air, mixing it with fuel, igniting the mixture, and expelling the expanding gases through a nozzle. At low speeds, this process produces relatively little thrust compared to the aircraft's weight. The 262 required approximately 1,000 meters of runway to become airborne, accelerating gradually from 0 to takeoff speed of 230 kilometers per hour. Every second on that runway represented potential death. The pilot sat exposed, unable to maneuver, watching his airspeed indicator climb while hoping no enemy fighters circled overhead. Werner Hoffmann understood these dangers intimately. He had witnessed 3 squadron mates die over the previous month, all killed during takeoff or landing approaches. Lieutenant Carl Becker had been caught on February 3rd when 4 Mustangs dove from altitude as he lifted off. The American fighters had simply waited at 15,000 feet, invisible against the overcast sky, watching the runway for the telltale signs of a jet launch. When Becker's aircraft rolled, they dove in a coordinated attack formation, their Packard-built Merlin engines screaming as they accelerated toward their target. Becker never had a chance. His aircraft cleared the runway with perhaps 50 meters of altitude when the first burst of 50 caliber machine gun fire struck his left engine. The turbine disintegrated in a bloom of flame. The Me-262 rolled inverted and impacted the ground at nearly 200 kilometers per hour. The psychological toll on German jet pilots was immense. Every mission began not with combat anxiety, but with takeoff terror. Pilots sat in their cockpits during engine startup, knowing that American fighters might be circling somewhere above the clouds, waiting for precisely this moment. The ground crews worked frantically to minimize runway time, but the jet's design made rapid launches impossible. The engines required careful temperature management during startup. Rushing the procedure risked engine failure, which would be equally fatal. The pilots faced an impossible choice: accept the risk of enemy attack or refuse to fly at all. On the morning of February 25th, the Luftwaffe's planning staff had ordered a maximum effort against American bomber formations attacking targets in central Germany. Intelligence reports indicated over 1,000 heavy bombers would strike industrial facilities around Magdeburg and Brunswick. The 262 units at Rheine-Hopsten received orders to intercept these formations with every available aircraft. This meant launching 18 jets simultaneously, the largest single sortie the unit had attempted. The tactical officers believed that multiple launches would overwhelm any American fighters patrolling the airfield. Some jets would inevitably face attack, but the majority would escape to altitude where their speed advantage became decisive. The Americans, however, had anticipated exactly this scenario. Captain William Bailey of the 55th Fighter Group had positioned 16 P-51 Mustangs at various altitudes around Rheine-Hopsten since dawn. His tactical plan divided the Mustangs into 4 ship elements, each responsible for attacking from a different direction. When the German jets began their takeoff rolls, the Americans would attack from north, south, east, and west simultaneously. The German jets couldn't evade in multiple directions at once. Some would certainly escape, but Bailey intended to destroy as many as possible before they reached operational altitude. The first indication Hoffmann had of enemy presence was the tower officer's urgent radio call. American fighters diving from the north. Hoffmann's aircraft had just begun its takeoff roll. His airspeed indicator showed 90 kilometers per hour. Too slow to lift off, too fast to abort safely. The wet runway surface, slick with morning frost, would make emergency braking dangerous. He had, perhaps, 10 seconds before his aircraft reached rotation speed, the moment when he would pull back on the control column and the nose wheel would lift. Those 10 seconds felt infinite. The distinctive profile of 4 P-51 Mustangs emerged from the low cloud deck approximately 3,000 meters north of the runway. Their bubble canopies caught the weak morning sunlight as they rolled into steep diving attacks. Bailey had timed the approach perfectly, waiting until the German jets committed to their takeoff rolls before initiating the attack. The Mustangs accelerated rapidly in the dive, their airspeed building toward 500 miles per hour. At that velocity, even the inherent speed difference between the jet and the conventional fighter became irrelevant. The Mustangs would arrive at the runway before the jets could climb to safety. Hoffmann's hands moved desperately across his controls, but the 262's design worked against him. The jet engines provided excellent thrust at high speeds, but relatively poor acceleration at low velocities. The heavy fuel load necessary for the jet's notorious consumption made the aircraft sluggish during the critical takeoff phase. German engineers had optimized the design for high-altitude interception missions against Allied bombers, not for desperate evasive maneuvers during takeoff. Every design decision that made the 262 deadly in its intended role now contributed to Hoffmann's vulnerability. The tactical doctrine employed by American fighter pilots during these airfield attacks reflected months of evolution and bitter experience. Initial attempts to intercept 262s in aerial combat had proven frustratingly ineffective. The German jets simply accelerated away from pursuing Mustangs, their superior speed rendering conventional pursuit futile. Allied pilots reported firing at jet fighters that seemed to vanish into the distance, their contrails mocking the Americans' inability to close within effective gun range. After-action reports from late 1944 consistently documented this frustration, prompting tactical re-evaluation at the highest levels of command. Major General William Kepner, commanding the 8th Air Force's fighter forces, had authorized the aggressive airfield interdiction campaign during a strategic planning conference in December 1944. According to declassified military records from the United States Air Force Historical Research Agency, Kepner recognized that Germany's jet fighter program represented a legitimate threat to Allied bomber operations. Despite the Reich's deteriorating strategic position, the 262 could theoretically inflict catastrophic losses on bomber formations if deployed in sufficient numbers with adequate fuel and experienced pilots. Preventing that scenario required unconventional tactics that accepted higher risks for attacking pilots while maximizing damage to German jet capabilities. The doctrine that emerged emphasized several key principles. First, continuous reconnaissance of known and suspected jet bases to identify operational patterns. Second, standing patrols timed to coincide with likely sortie launches, typically dawn and dusk when visibility favored attackers. Third, coordinated attacks by multiple aircraft to overwhelm defensive measures and ensure target destruction. Fourth, acceptance of ground fire risk to press attacks home with maximum effectiveness. These principles transformed American fighter operations from primarily defensive escort missions to aggressively offensive hunter-killer operations. Captain Bailey's Mustangs completed their diving attacks with the practiced efficiency of pilots who had executed this maneuver dozens of times. The first burst of 50 caliber machine gun fire struck the runway approximately 100 meters ahead of Hoffmann's aircraft, sending fragments of concrete and tracer rounds arcing across his flight path. Bailey had deliberately fired short, walking his rounds toward the target rather than attempting a single devastating burst. This technique, learned through hard experience, accounted for variables like relative motion, wind drift, and target maneuvers. The tracer rounds, every fifth bullet in the ammunition belt, created visible streams of fire that allowed the pilot to adjust his aim in real time. The psychological effect on the target pilot was equally valuable. Seeing those streams of fire approaching created terror that disrupted rational decision-making. Hoffmann jerked the control column right, attempting to veer off the runway despite his insufficient airspeed. The 262 responded sluggishly, its nose gear turning, but the aircraft maintaining most of its forward momentum. The jet's wheels left the concrete, transitioning onto the grass verge that bordered the runway. This softer surface immediately reduced the aircraft's speed, creating additional drag that made flight even less likely. The reduction in forward velocity meant the wings generated less lift. The aircraft began sinking back toward the ground, even as Hoffmann fought to maintain altitude. Behind Hoffmann's aircraft, Lieutenant Thomas Hayes from Wisconsin adjusted his attack angle to account for this maneuver. Hayes had joined the 55th Fighter Group in February 1945, making him relatively inexperienced compared to veterans like Bailey. Yet, the tactical doctrine for airfield attacks was simple enough that even newer pilots could execute it effectively. Identify the target during its takeoff roll. Dive from altitude to build airspeed. Open fire at approximately 400 meters. Continue firing until either the target is destroyed or defensive fire becomes too dangerous. Hayes followed this procedure with mechanical precision. The second burst of 50 caliber fire struck Hoffmann's 262 with devastating accuracy. The rounds impacted the aircraft's left engine nacelle, penetrating the thin aluminum skin and severing fuel lines. The Junkers engine, spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, ingested fuel vapor from the damaged lines and immediately caught fire. The turbine section, already stressed by the demands of maximum thrust, disintegrated catastrophically when the flames reached the compressor blades. Fragments of metal erupted outward, shredding the surrounding structure. The left side of Hoffmann's aircraft disappeared in an explosion of orange flame and black smoke. The structural failure created immediate aerodynamic imbalance. The Tu-62 rolled violently left as the destroyed engine produced massive drag instead of thrust. Hoffmann fought the controls with both hands, but basic physics had rendered his aircraft unflyable. The right engine, still producing full thrust, pushed the aircraft into an accelerating left turn that no amount of control input could overcome. The jet's nose dropped toward the ground as airspeed bled away catastrophically. Hoffmann's altimeter indicated less than 20 meters, insufficient altitude for parachute deployment, even if he could somehow exit the tumbling aircraft. The Tu-62 impacted the frozen ground at approximately 180 kilometers per hour, striking at a shallow angle that sent it tumbling across the grass field adjacent to the runway. The impact forces exceeded anything the airframe was designed to withstand. The cockpit section separated from the fuselage. The wings folded backward. The remaining fuel, nearly 800 liters of volatile kerosene, ignited upon impact. The fireball consumed what remained of the aircraft's structure within seconds. Werner Hoffmann died instantly, one of 6 German jet pilots who would perish at Rheine-Hopsten that morning. The attack on Rheine-Hopsten represented one engagement in a systematic campaign that spanned dozens of Luftwaffe bases across Germany during the war's final months. Allied intelligence had identified the 30 airfields capable of supporting Tu-62 operations, and each became a priority target for both bombing and fighter interdiction. The 8th Air Force's fighter groups, including the 4th, 56th, 55th, 357th, and 361st, flew hundreds of sorties specifically targeting these facilities between February and May 1945. Statistical analysis of combat reports from this period reveals the devastating effectiveness of these tactics. During March 1945 alone, American fighters destroyed or damaged an estimated 47 Tu-62s. Approximately 32 of these kills occurred during takeoff or landing phases, according to records compiled by military historians analyzing gun camera footage and mission reports. The kill ratio during airfield attacks heavily favored the Americans. They typically lost 1 fighter for every 5 to 7 jets destroyed. This contrasted dramatically with air-to-air engagement statistics, where the Tu-62's speed advantage made it nearly impossible to shoot down when flown by competent pilots who maintained their energy advantage. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe jet pilots proved equally significant. Interviews with surviving German pilots conducted after the war revealed deep anxiety about these tactics. Oberleutnant Heinz Baer, one of Germany's highest-scoring jet aces with 16 confirmed kills while flying the Tu-62, later described the takeoff phase as worse than combat itself. The helplessness of sitting in an accelerating aircraft while knowing enemy fighters might be diving from above created sustained stress that degraded pilot performance and unit morale. Some pilots developed psychosomatic symptoms, tremors, nausea, panic attacks that rendered them unable to fly effectively. German tactical responses evolved throughout this period, but never achieved decisive success. The Luftwaffe attempted to establish dedicated fighter protection units specifically assigned to defend jet bases during critical takeoff and landing periods. Conventional Focke-Wulf 190 fighters and Messerschmitt 109 fighters flew standing patrols over airfields. These aircraft faced their own vulnerabilities. However, American pilots simply increased their attacking force sizes, sending 8 or 12 Mustangs instead of 4, with some aircraft designated to engage defenders, while others pressed attacks against the jets themselves. More elaborate defensive schemes included coordinated smokescreen deployment to obscure runway visibility, multiple simultaneous launches to divide attacking forces, and even experimental rocket-assisted takeoff systems designed to reduce runway time. None proved sustainable. Given Germany's resource constraints, the smokescreens required chemicals that were increasingly unavailable. Multiple simultaneous launches consumed fuel that couldn't be replaced. Rocket-assisted takeoff systems added weight and complexity while introducing new failure modes. Each attempted countermeasure revealed the fundamental problem. Germany lacked the resources to protect its technological advantages. The systematic destruction of Tu-62s on the ground contributed significantly to the Luftwaffe's collapse during the war's final weeks. Production figures indicated that Messerschmitt factories manufactured approximately 1,400 Tu-62 aircraft between April 1944 and April 1945. Yet operational strength never exceeded approximately 200 aircraft at any given time. The disparity between production and operational availability revealed the cascading failures afflicting Germany's war economy. Aircraft were destroyed in transit by Allied fighter bombers. They were damaged beyond repair during Allied bombing raids on airfields. They sat immobile due to fuel shortages or lack of replacement engines. They were abandoned as ground forces retreated before advancing Allied armies. The aerial warfare tactics employed during spring 1945 existed within a broader strategic context that shaped every engagement. By February, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine River and advanced deep into German territory. The Red Army approached Berlin from the east, crushing remaining Wehrmacht units with overwhelming numerical superiority. Germany's industrial capacity had been shattered by years of strategic bombing. Transportation networks lay in ruins, making it nearly impossible to move troops, equipment, or resources effectively. The Third Reich's military situation had deteriorated beyond any reasonable hope of recovery. Within this collapsing strategic framework, the Tu-62 program represented technological achievement divorced from strategic reality. The jet fighter required high-grade aviation fuel that Germany could no longer produce in sufficient quantities. It demanded maintenance by skilled technicians, most of whom had been drafted into infantry units to slow the Allied advance. It needed pilots with extensive training, but the Luftwaffe's flight schools had been systematically destroyed or forced to cease operations due to fuel shortages. Most critically, the Tu-62 required time. Time to accumulate operational experience, time to develop effective tactics, time to train adequate numbers of pilots. Germany had run out of time. The human cost of these operations extended far beyond individual engagements like the attack on Rheine-Hopsten. Between January and May 1945, approximately 370 Luftwaffe pilots died in Tu-62 related accidents and combat losses. American fighter losses during the same period totaled approximately 90 aircraft destroyed during airfield attacks, representing roughly 180 aircrew killed or captured. These numbers reflected the brutal mathematics of air warfare. Technological sophistication meant nothing against determined opponents who understood your weaknesses and possessed the resources to exploit them relentlessly. The tactical innovation represented by the Airfield interdiction campaign influenced post-war military doctrine significantly. Air forces worldwide studied these operations, recognizing that technological superiority alone could not guarantee battlefield success. The most advanced aircraft in the world became useless if it couldn't survive the vulnerable moments of takeoff and landing. American air power doctrine incorporated the principle that technological advantages could be negated through tactical innovation and aggressive implementation. The Air Force's Tactical Air Command developed detailed studies of the Airfield interdiction campaign. identifying key success factors, including comprehensive intelligence preparation, continuous reconnaissance, coordinated multi-aircraft attacks, and willingness to accept calculated risks. Major Georg Peter Eder, flying with Jagdverband 44, later described the period as flying with one eye on the sky and one eye on the fuel gauge. Knowing that American fighters waited at both ends of every mission, the psychological burden of fighting a losing war while piloting technologically advanced aircraft created unique stresses. German pilots watched their country disintegrate while they flew missions that seemed increasingly pointless. The cognitive dissonance between their aircraft's capabilities and their inability to influence the war's outcome generated profound disillusionment. American pilots experienced different psychological pressures during these final weeks. Many recognized that Germany's surrender was imminent, raising moral questions about continuing aggressive operations. Was destroying enemy aircraft worth risking American lives when victory seemed assured? Squadron commanders struggled with these questions while maintaining operational effectiveness. Some pilots became more cautious, avoiding unnecessary risks. Others pressed attacks more aggressively, believing that ending the war faster would ultimately save lives. The tactical calculus remained brutal, regardless of philosophical considerations. Every mission required discipline, skill, and the acceptance that survival was never guaranteed. The final large-scale air action involving Tu-62s in significant numbers occurred on April 10, 1945, when 55 jets took off to engage more than 2,000 United States heavy bombers and escorts attacking targets in the Berlin area. This engagement would become known among American fighter pilots as the Day of the Great Jet Massacre. The Tu-62 units claimed the destruction of 10 B-17s and 7 escort fighters, and these claims find general support in American records. Yet, the cost was catastrophic. 27 Tu-62s were destroyed. Almost half of those committed to battle. 19 pilots were killed and 5 wounded. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Many of the jet fighters were caught as they returned to their airfields short of fuel after they had slowed down to begin the landing approach. That was a black day for the Tu-62 units, revealing in stark terms the fundamental impossibility of their situation. They could inflict losses on American formations. Certainly, the jets remained deadly when properly employed by skilled pilots at high altitude with adequate fuel. But the Americans possessed resources to absorb those losses and continue operations without meaningful disruption. The Germans did not. The engagement on April 10th represented the culmination of tactical evolution on both sides. German jet pilots had developed increasingly sophisticated attack techniques. They employed coordinated formation attacks using the newly developed R-4M Orkan unguided rocket projectiles. Each Tu-62 could carry 24 of these 55mm rockets mounted beneath its wings. When fired into bomber formations from approximately 1,000 meters, the rockets proved devastatingly effective. A single rocket hit could destroy a heavy bomber. Salvo, firing all 24 rockets into a tight formation of 60 B-17s, created carnage. Yet even these tactical innovations couldn't overcome the fundamental operational constraints. The rockets added weight and drag, reducing the jet's performance. More critically, firing rockets required the pilot to fly a predictable approach path for several seconds while the rockets left their rails. During those vulnerable seconds, escort fighters could engage. The Tu-62's speed advantage meant nothing if the aircraft had to maintain steady flight for weapons employment. American fighter pilots learned to recognize the telltale flash of rocket launches and immediately attacked the firing jet. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group had refined his tactics specifically to counter jet rocket attacks. His tactical doctrine called for positioning Mustang elements at multiple altitudes around bomber formations. When jets appeared at high altitude preparing to attack, Some Mustangs would climb to engage, while others descended to position themselves along likely escape routes. The jets had to dive away after firing their rockets to build speed and escape. Myers pilots waited along those dive paths, using altitude advantage and gravity to build closing speeds that partially negated the jet's technological superiority. At the March 18, 1945 raid on Berlin demonstrated both the Tu-62's potential and its limitations with brutal clarity. 37 jets from Jagdgeschwader 7 intercepted a force of 1,221 bombers, escorted by 632 fighters. This represented the largest coordinated jet attack of the war. The German pilots employed their rocket tactics with devastating effect, shooting down 12 bombers and 1 fighter for the loss of 3 Tu-62s. The 4-to-1 kill ratio was exactly what the Luftwaffe needed to make a meaningful impact on the war. Yet, the absolute scale of success was minor. 12 bombers represented less than 1% of the attacking force. The remaining 1,200 bombers proceeded to their targets, dropped approximately 3,000 tons of explosives on Berlin, and returned to their bases in England. Within 48 hours, those 12 lost bombers were replaced by new aircraft fresh from American factories. The 3 lost Tu-62s, conversely, represented irreplaceable assets. The pilots who died possessed training and experience that couldn't be replaced. The aircraft themselves required weeks to manufacture under increasingly difficult conditions. The strategic mathematics were inescapable. Germany needed to destroy American bombers at a rate far exceeding what even the most successful jet attacks achieved. To meaningfully disrupt the bombing campaign, the Luftwaffe would need to destroy 300 to 400 bombers per month consistently over several months. This would require shooting down 15 to 20 bombers during every raid, sustained over dozens of missions. Even with perfect execution and unlimited fuel, the Tu-62 force could never achieve these numbers. Meanwhile, Allied armies advanced relentlessly across German territory. By April, Soviet forces approached Berlin from the east, while American and British armies pushed from the west. One by one, the jet fighter bases had to be abandoned as ground forces retreated. Parchim Airfield fell to Soviet forces in early May. Rheine-Hopsten was overrun by British units. The Tu-62 operations underwent rapid decline as the physical territory controlled by the Reich shrank to isolated pockets. The individual stories of German jet pilots during this period reveal the complex human dimensions of technological warfare divorced from strategic viability. Many were skilled, experienced aviators who had survived years of combat over Europe and Russia. They understood aircraft performance intuitively, having logged thousands of hours in high-performance fighters. This experience allowed them to extract maximum capability from their jets, achieving kills against seemingly impossible odds. Yet experience couldn't overcome the fundamental challenges they faced. Oberleutnant Heinz Baer flew Tu-62s with Jagdverband 44 during the war's final months, accumulating 16 confirmed kills in the jet. His total wartime score exceeded 200 victories, making him one of Germany's most successful fighter pilots. Baer's tactical skill was beyond question. He understood energy management, deflection shooting, and formation tactics at an intuitive level that separated elite pilots from merely competent ones. When Baer engaged enemy aircraft in his Tu-62, he possessed every advantage that technology and experience could provide. Yet even Baer couldn't change the war's outcome. His 16 kills, achieved at great personal risk over dozens of missions, made no measurable impact on Allied bomber operations. For every bomber he destroyed, 10 more appeared the next day. His tactical brilliance meant nothing within the broader strategic context of Germany's collapse. This generated a particular kind of psychological burden. Pilots like Baer knew they were fighting exceptionally well by any reasonable standard, yet their efforts achieved nothing of strategic value. American pilots faced no such existential questions. Their mission was clear: escort the bombers to their targets, destroy any enemy aircraft that attempted to interfere, and return safely to base. Success was measured in simple terms. Did the bombers reach their targets? Were losses within acceptable limits? The answers throughout spring 1945 were consistently yes. This clarity of purpose, combined with obvious progress toward final victory, sustained morale even during difficult missions. Captain William Bailey of the 55th Fighter Group flew his final combat mission on April 28, 1945. By that date, organized Luftwaffe resistance had effectively ceased. German jet bases had been overrun or abandoned. The few remaining operational 262s flew sporadic missions that achieved little beyond adding to the casualty lists. Bailey's logbook recorded 112 combat missions over Germany, including 23 encounters with jet aircraft. He had participated in airfield attacks, bomber escort missions, and ground support operations during the final Allied advance into Germany. Bailey survived the war and returned to the United States, eventually becoming a commercial airline pilot. In post-war interviews, he rarely discussed his combat experiences in detail. This reticence was common among veterans who struggled to reconcile their wartime actions with peacetime civilian life. The men Bailey had killed were enemy combatants, certainly, but also fellow pilots who shared his love of flight and understood the same technical challenges. The moral complexity of aerial warfare, particularly during the war's final weeks when Germany's defeat was assured, troubled many veterans for decades. The 262 program ultimately demonstrated that technological innovation alone cannot overcome strategic failure, resource constraints, and tactical vulnerability. Germany developed a revolutionary aircraft that pointed toward aviation's future, yet deployed it within a strategic context that guaranteed failure. The Allied response, identifying vulnerabilities and exploiting them through tactical innovation and overwhelming resources, revealed that warfare remained fundamentally about matching capabilities to circumstances, understanding enemy weaknesses, and executing with discipline and courage. The 7th of May, 1945, brought Germany's unconditional surrender, officially ending the war in Europe. Approximately 100 operational jets remained scattered across Germany when fighting ceased, many abandoned at their bases as crews fled approaching Allied forces. American and Soviet intelligence teams moved quickly to secure these aircraft for technical evaluation. The jets represented the cutting edge of aviation technology, and both nations recognized the value of studying them thoroughly. Captain Eric Brown, Britain's chief naval test pilot, flew a captured 262 at Lübeck in July 1945. His post-flight report praised the aircraft's performance characteristics while noting the temperamental engines and demanding flight characteristics. Brown's assessment concluded that the 262 was indeed a formidable weapon when properly maintained and adequately fueled, but those conditions never existed in operational reality. The aircraft had been deployed into an impossible logistical environment and failed accordingly. American engineers at Wright Field in Ohio conducted extensive testing of captured 262s throughout late 1945 and early 1946. These tests confirmed the jet's speed advantage over conventional fighters while revealing significant limitations. The engines required replacement after 10 to 25 hours of operation. The aircraft's range was severely limited by high fuel consumption. Most critically, the design incorporated no provision for effective combat operations at low speeds or altitudes. The 262 was optimized for high-altitude interception missions, making it vulnerable during the takeoff and landing phases that American tactics specifically exploited. Soviet engineers conducted similar evaluations of captured jets, using the technical knowledge gained to accelerate their own jet fighter programs. The Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-15, which would achieve fame during the Korean War, incorporated design lessons learned from studying the 262. British designers examined captured examples extensively, though their Gloucester Meteor had already achieved operational status. using different technical approaches. The global proliferation of jet fighter technology traced direct lineage to Germany's wartime innovations. Yet, the most important lessons from the Tu-62 program were operational rather than technical. The aircraft demonstrated conclusively that technological superiority means nothing without the infrastructure to produce, maintain, and sustain that technology at scale. Germany built a revolutionary aircraft but lacked the resources to employ it effectively. The United States built an adequate aircraft and possessed unlimited resources to employ it overwhelmingly. This fundamental truth shaped military aviation doctrine for decades following the war. The post-war analysis conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey provided comprehensive assessment of the Tu-62 program's failure. The survey involved over 1,000 economists, engineers, and military analysts who examined every aspect of Germany's war economy. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Germany's defeat was inevitable once Allied air superiority was achieved, not because Allied aircraft were superior, but because Allied industrial capacity was unassailable. The survey noted that even if Germany had deployed 5 times as many Tu-62 aircraft, the outcome would have been unchanged because the underlying resource constraints would have remained. Fuel shortages would have grounded the expanded jet force. Pilot training programs couldn't have produced adequate numbers of qualified aircrew. The systematic destruction of transportation networks would have prevented effective deployment regardless of production numbers. Industrial capacity alone couldn't overcome strategic and logistical collapse. This conclusion challenged romantic notions about technology and warfare that persist in popular imagination. People prefer stories where better weapons determine victory, where revolutionary technology overcomes numerical disadvantages through superior performance. The Tu-62 story reveals a more prosaic reality. The side with more resources, better logistics, and sustainable production wins. Quality matters, but quantity has a quality all its own, as Soviet military theorists would later observe. The P-51 Mustang's success exemplified this principle perfectly. The Mustang wasn't the fastest fighter in 1945, nor the most heavily armed, nor the most maneuverable. It was good enough across all dimensions while being easy to manufacture, simple to maintain, and capable of extended range with external fuel tanks. Most importantly, American industry could produce Mustangs faster than Germany could shoot them down. This advantage proved decisive. Modern military historians often cite the Tu-62 when discussing the relationship between technology and strategy. It serves as a cautionary tale about innovation without infrastructure, advancement without sustainability, and tactical brilliance undermined by strategic failure. Germany invested enormous resources developing revolutionary weapons including the Tu-62, the V-2 rocket, advanced submarines, and heavy tanks, while its fundamental war economy collapsed. The Americans took the opposite approach. They deployed adequate technology supported by overwhelming logistical networks. Their fighters were good enough. Their bombers were good enough. Their training programs, maintenance infrastructure, and supply chains were unmatched. They won not through brilliance, but through competence executed at massive scale. This lesson resonated through post-war military planning and continues to influence defense procurement decisions today. In the end, the revolutionary jet fighter that should have dominated the skies became a footnote to history. The conventional Mustang, meanwhile, became the symbol of Allied air superiority. Technology lost to logistics. Innovation was defeated by implementation. The best fighter plane in the world proved meaningless when it couldn't fly, couldn't be maintained, and couldn't be produced in sufficient numbers to matter. Werner Hoffmann died on February 25, 1945, one pilot among thousands who perished during World War II's final months. His death achieved nothing strategically significant. Germany would have lost regardless of whether his sortie succeeded or failed. Yet his experience reflected the broader tragedy of technological warfare divorced from strategic reality. Brilliant engineering and courageous pilots could not overcome fundamental resource constraints and flawed strategic decisions made years earlier. The broader question of whether the aggressive airfield attacks were justified remains debated among military historians. The operations achieved their immediate tactical objectives, neutralizing the Tu-62 threat and maintaining Allied air superiority. However, this came at the cost of approximately 180 American aircrew lives during a period when Germany's defeat was essentially guaranteed. Some historians argue that more conservative tactics would have achieved similar strategic results with fewer casualties. Others contend that aggressive operations shortened the war overall, ultimately saving lives by hastening Germany's surrender. The Tu-62 program's legacy extended beyond its tactical failures into fundamental questions about military innovation and resource allocation. Had Germany deployed the jet fighter earlier, in greater numbers, with adequate fuel and trained pilots, could it have altered the war's outcome? Most historians conclude the answer is no. The underlying strategic situation, Germany's resource constraints, and Allied industrial advantages would have remained regardless of when the Tu-62 entered service. Yet the question itself reveals important insights about technological development during wartime. Germany's jet program suffered from political interference, resource competition, and strategic confusion from its inception. Hermann Göring and Adolf Hitler repeatedly changed the aircraft's intended role, delaying production while engineers adapted the design. These delays meant the Tu-62 entered service too late to influence events, even had all other factors been favorable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.